5 of Canada's wealthiest women thought they were competing for a criminal empire's throne. They arrived in Vancouver on private jets, wore wardrobe budgets larger than most people's mortgages, and hired image consultants to help them perform motherhood convincingly enough to fool a grieving child. But they never understood what they were actually auditioning for. Dominic Reeves wasn't looking for a wife to sit beside him at charity galas. He was looking for someone willing to bleed for his daughter. And the only woman in that penthouse who had already taken a bullet for Aria, literally, was the American bodyguard they had spent 3 weeks trying to have deported. Welcome back. Today's story is proof that you can buy a penthouse on the 47th floor, hire a PR team to polish your image, make and walk into a room looking like someone's idea of the perfect mother, and a 9-year-old girl will still see straight through every single layer of it. In the heart of Vancouver's criminal underworld, Aria Reeves has been handed an impossible task by her dying father. Choose a new mother from a lineup of 5 powerful, desperate, dangerous women who each have their own reasons for needing this marriage to happen. And while those 5 women are busy drafting psychological reports, pulling immigration records, and conspiring in 5-star suites to eliminate the one person standing between them and Dominic Reeves' empire, they are about to discover that Jordan Hayes is not just the bodyguard. She is a former United States Secret Service agent. She carries a secret about Aria's dead mother that nobody in that building is prepared to hear, and she is the only person in Aria's life who has ever chosen the child's safety over her own survival. Not as a performance, not for an audience, but alone in a parking garage with a gun pointed at a 9-year-old girl. Stay with me, because what happens next will change how you think about loyalty, sacrifice, and what it actually means to choose a family. But to understand why Aria looked past 5 of the most accomplished women in Canada and fixed her eyes on the one standing in the doorway in tactical black, you have to go back. Back to the night that started everything. Back to a woman named Claire. And back to a promise made at a graveside in Washington, D.C. that Jordan Hayes has been keeping ever since, one sleepless night at a time, in a city that was never supposed to feel like home. If this story has you hooked, already subscribe to this channel. It means a lot to us, and it makes us know that you're here. By 7 the next morning, all 5 women had claimed their territory. Guest suites on the penthouse's east wing had been transformed overnight into operational headquarters, designer luggage unpacked with military precision, skincare routines established, schedules mentally drafted. If you didn't know better, you might have mistaken it for 5 very elegant house guests settling in for a pleasant Vancouver autumn. But Dominic Reeves hadn't built an empire by misreading rooms. And if he had pulled the real files on each woman, not the curated bios his assistant had prepared, but the actual truth festering beneath the surface, what he would have found wasn't ambition. It was desperation, 5 different flavors of it, all of them equally dangerous. Celeste Fontaine had arrived first, which she believed communicated something important about her character. What it actually communicated was anxiety. At 51, Montreal's most photographed philanthropist had 2 custody battles buried in sealed court records, a restraining order that had cost her a 7-figure legal fee to keep quiet, and a charitable foundation currently under quiet scrutiny by the Quebec Revenue Agency. She didn't want Aria. She wanted the social armor that came with being Mrs. Dominic Reeves, the kind of legitimacy that made journalists stop digging. A Mafia king's wife didn't get audited. A Mafia king's wife got left alone. Doctor. But Margot Thibault wanted something slightly more specific, for a family in Toronto to stop returning her lawyer's calls. 18 months ago, a patient had died on her table following a procedure Margot had classified as routine. The second opinion confirming her judgment had been forged. A favor from a colleague who owed her, signed with the name of a doctor who'd been on sabbatical in Portugal at the time. The family had recently hired a forensic medical consultant. The consultant had recently hired an attorney. Margot needed that paper trail to disappear, and there was exactly one man in Canada with both the legal infrastructure and the appetite for making inconvenient documents cease to exist. Simone Okafor-Pierce's ex-husband was alive. She knew precisely where. The Interpol flag on his name existed because of a financial crime she had helped him commit before she'd decided he was more useful as a liability than a husband. The people who had assisted with his disappearance, men who operated out of a Richmond warehouse Simone had never officially visited, were now charging what she could only describe as an ongoing maintenance fee for their silence. She needed protection of a caliber that money alone couldn't buy. She needed someone whose name made dangerous men reconsider their pricing. Elena Vasquez had flown in from Calgary looking composed and carrying a secret that kept her awake until 3 every morning. The federal investigation into her energy company's finances was survivable. What was not survivable was her brother Marco, currently in a minimum security facility in Edmonton, and currently cooperating with prosecutors in exchange for a reduced sentence, currently dismantling 17 years of carefully constructed distance between Elena's public life and the money that had actually built it. She needed Marco to stop talking. Dominic Reeves could make that happen with a single phone call. And then there was Brigitte Laval, 31, who hadn't chosen to be here at all. Her debts to Lucien Marchand, Vancouver's most patient predator, the man who had been circling Dominic's empire for years, had long since crossed the threshold where they were debts and become something closer to ownership. She was in this penthouse because Marchand had told her to be. Every conversation she had, every detail she observed, and every vulnerability she could identify in Dominic's household was being reported back through a burner phone she kept taped behind the bathroom mirror in her guest suite. She wasn't competing. She was infiltrating, and she was terrified of what happened to her if she stopped. They gathered in Celeste's suite at 9 that morning, ostensibly for coffee. Within 4 minutes, the conversation had found its real subject. Jordan Hayes. "She's not even trying," Celeste said, setting down her cup with quiet precision. "And she's already winning." Nobody disagreed. The alliance formed in the silence that followed, unspoken, unanimous, and quietly merciless. Jordan Hayes was awake at 5 every morning without an alarm. Old habit. Government-trained precision that private security work hadn't softened. By 5:15, she had completed her perimeter check of the penthouse's 4 access points, reviewed 12 hours of overnight surveillance footage at 2 times speed, cross-referenced the morning's threat assessment with Marcus's overnight report, and prepared Aria's daily schedule in the leather notebook she kept on the kitchen counter. Clinical, methodical. The kind of routine that left no room for anything that wasn't strictly operational. By 5:30, Aria was sitting on the kitchen counter in her pajamas, stealing Jordan's coffee. She did this every morning. Jordan had stopped pretending to be surprised about it 3 months ago. The first time it had happened, the first time Jordan had allowed it to keep happening, she'd told herself it was a security consideration. And better to have the principal visible and contained than wandering a dark penthouse unsupervised at odd hours. It was a reasonable, professional justification. She had repeated it to herself often enough that she'd almost believed it. What she didn't allow herself to examine too closely was the other reason. The one that lived in the memory of a parking garage 6 months ago. Aria's back pressed against a concrete pillar, a shooter advancing from the east stairwell, and Jordan moving without thinking, not calculating, not assessing, just placing her body between the gun and the child with the absolute certainty of someone acting on something much older than training. The bullet had caught her in the left shoulder. She'd taken the shooter down left-handed before she hit the ground. In the hospital that night, but Aria had sat beside her bed for 4 hours, refusing to leave despite Dominic's instructions, her small face unreadable in the way it got when she was working through something too large for words. Finally, she'd asked, "Why did you do that?" Jordan had answered the only way she knew how. Because that's my job. Aria had looked at her for a long moment with those dark, unsettling eyes that saw further than a 9-year-old's eyes had any right to. You didn't look like it was your job, she'd said quietly. You looked like it was something else. Jordan hadn't answered. She hadn't had an answer that was both honest and safe to give. Their morning ritual had evolved without either of them designing it. Jordan read aloud from whatever Aria had left on the counter the night before. French novels, mostly. That because Aria was bilingual and had developed an early appreciation for the particular torture of watching Jordan attempt Quebecois pronunciation. Le souffrance, Jordan attempted. La souffrance, Aria corrected, not looking up from her orange juice. You keep swallowing the endings. It's not a suggestion, the ending. It belongs there. It belongs there, Jordan repeated. Better. Slightly. Small moments. Inconsequential by every professional metric Jordan had ever been trained to apply. But in a penthouse full of performance and strategy and 5 women competing at maximum intensity, these quiet mornings were the only thing in Aria's day that felt like something other than an audition. Jordan knew this. She also knew, with the uncomfortable clarity of someone who had spent years being honest with herself about threat assessments, that she had long since crossed a line she couldn't uncross. This child was no longer an assignment. She had not yet figured out what to do with that information. From the hallway entrance to the kitchen, Celeste Fontaine watched the morning ritual for exactly 4 minutes before returning to her suite and opening her laptop. The formal complaint she drafted to Dominic ran to 2 careful paragraphs. It cited anxious attachment theory, the psychological risk of children forming primary bonds with temporary employees, and her own, entirely fabricated, concern for Aria's long-term emotional stability. She sent it at 6:45. Dominic read it at 7. He set it aside. Then, after a long moment of stillness, he pulled up Jordan's personnel file on his encrypted drive. Not the summary his assistant maintained, but the original. And the one from the agency, the one that went further back. He began reading. And somewhere around page 4, he went very still. They met in Celeste's suite at 8 that evening with the door locked and the television running loud enough to matter. 5 women, 1 agenda, and the particular energy of people who have decided that being right about something justifies whatever comes next. Celeste opened. Complaints haven't moved him. Charm hasn't moved the child. We need to be surgical. Brigitte, who had spent the afternoon on a 20-minute call through the bathroom burner, receiving instructions she would never repeat aloud in this room, leaned forward with the measured calm of someone delivering a strategy they hadn't invented themselves. Don't attack her competence, she said. You'll lose that argument. And she's demonstrably excellent at her job, and Dominic knows it. Attack her appropriateness. Make him feel that Jordan Hayes is a liability to Aria's emotional development, not an asset. Frame it as protection, because that's the only language he listens to. The room absorbed this. I can build that case, Dr. Margot said. She had it drafted by midnight, 4 pages properly formatted, citing 3 peer-reviewed studies on childhood grief responses and anxious attachment formation. The conclusion was clinical and unambiguous. Aria Reeves displayed significant indicators of an unhealthy primary attachment to a temporary employee, a pattern that, if left unaddressed, would compound her existing grief trauma and impair her ability to form stable relationships in adulthood. It was, structurally, a sound psychological argument. It was also almost entirely fabricated in its application. But Margot had buried harder truths than this with less compelling paperwork. Simone worked a different angle. Her real estate network stretched across every municipal and provincial licensing office in British Columbia, which meant she had quiet access to the kind of administrative detail most people never thought to check. Jordan's work visa classifications, her contractor status, the specific provisions of her employment agreement with Dominic's security firm, and whether any of its terms created immigration technicalities that a well-placed inquiry might agitate into something larger. She found 3 possibilities worth pursuing. She forwarded them to an immigration attorney she trusted to ask questions without asking questions. Elena said nothing during most of this. She had been quiet since that afternoon, when the government database contacts she'd cultivated over years of federal proximity had pulled Jordan's full employment history and sent it to Elena's encrypted personal account. She'd read it twice, then she'd sat with it for a long time. Jordan Hayes, formerly Special Agent Jordan Hayes, United States Secret Service, Protective Detail Division, assigned to a single protectee for 26 months. Assignment closed following the protectee's death. The protectee's name was in the file. Elena had not shared it with the group. She would, when the moment was worth the most. For now, she said only, "She wasn't a contractor before this. She was Secret Service. Her protectee died. That's why she left." The room shifted with the weight of it. "That's leverage," Celeste said. "That's a weapon," Elena corrected quietly. "There's a difference." The opportunity came 2 days later, constructed with the precision of people who had stopped pretending their intentions were innocent. Brigitte placed a call to Marcus, flagging a reported breach in the building's east parking structure, specific enough to sound credible, vague enough to require Jordan's personal assessment. Jordan left at 2:15. The 5 women moved into the sitting room where Aria was reading, carrying gifts selected with the careful research of people who had studied a child the way a prosecutor studies a witness. First editions, a hand-painted music box, a cashmere throw in Aria's favorite shade of blue. They arranged themselves around her with rehearsed warmth and waited for something to take root. Aria looked at the gifts, and then at each face in turn with those quiet, measuring eyes. "These are beautiful," she said politely. "Thank you." A beat. Then, "I need Jordan. Can you please go get her?" The silence that followed was the kind that doesn't recover easily. And somewhere in the building's east parking structure, Jordan Hayes, who had found nothing because there was nothing to find, was already heading back upstairs. She had no idea what she was walking into. No idea that by the end of the week, her entire history would be sitting on a table in Dominic Reeves' office, every layer stripped away. No idea that the secret she'd been carrying for 14 months was about to change everything. For all of them. If you need to know what's in that file, what Jordan has been hiding since the day she walked into this penthouse, you already know what to do. I subscribe now. Stay with us, because what comes next will break your heart before it puts it back together. The scotch had been poured at midnight. By 2 in the morning, it was still untouched, and Dominic hadn't moved from his chair. The encrypted screen cast pale light across his face. The file was 43 pages. He had read it 3 times. Special Agent Jordan Hayes, United States Secret Service, Protective Detail Division, Active Service, 11 years. Commendations, 4. Disciplinary record, none. Assignment history. And there it was, buried in the middle of page 9 like something ordinary. Primary protectee, Senator Claire Beaumont Reeves. Duration, 26 months. Assignment status, closed following protectee's departure from Senate and relocation to Vancouver, Canada. Dominic read the name twice. Then he set down the file and stared at the wall for a long time. Claire Beaumont Reeves, his wife, Aria's mother, the woman whose laugh had been the loudest thing in every room she'd ever entered, who had left a career in American politics to follow a man she probably shouldn't have trusted into a city that had ultimately killed her. Jordan had known her. Not casually, not in passing. For 26 months, Jordan Hayes had stood between Claire and every threat the world could manufacture, had learned her schedule and her habits, and the particular way she tilted her head when she was about to say something that would change the direction of a conversation. Jordan had known Claire the way only a protection agent knows a person, completely, structurally, from the inside out. He kept reading. Now, the assignment had closed when Claire resigned her Senate seat and moved to Vancouver. Jurisdiction ended at the border. The file noted the closure as routine. There was nothing routine about what came next. A supplementary document filed internally and never formally actioned, dated 14 months ago, 3 days before Claire died. Agent Hayes requested emergency authorization for unofficial travel to Vancouver, BC, citing a personal welfare concern for former protectee. Request denied. No active assignment, no jurisdictional basis. Agent Hayes submitted resignation from active service the following morning. Dominic's jaw tightened. She had resigned. Boarded a flight anyway. Paid for it herself, because Claire had called her. That 3 days before the hit-and-run that the Vancouver police had ruled accidental, and that Dominic had spent 14 months knowing was neither accidental nor random. Claire had called Jordan and said words that the file didn't contain, but that Dominic could reconstruct without effort, because he knew what Claire had known in those final weeks. That something was closing in, that the world she'd married into had finally found the shape of a threat she couldn't outrun. Jordan had landed in Vancouver 12 hours after Claire was killed. He sat with that for a long time. 12 hours. The distance between protection and loss measured in the cruelest possible unit of time. And then, 8 months later, a resume had crossed his security firm's desk. Jordan Hayes, formerly DC-based private contractor, seeking placement in executive protection. The credentials were exceptional. The reference letters impeccable. The cover story airtight. All of it constructed to get her into this building, near this child. To keep a promise Dominic suspected she had made at a graveside in a city where she had no reason to stay. He closed the file, picked up his phone. Marcus. His voice was quiet and absolutely even. I need you to find out who ordered the hit on Claire. Not who I've been assuming ordered it. Who actually did. Because I've been looking in the wrong direction for 14 months, and I think someone has been counting on that. He ended the call. Sat another moment in the dark. Then he stood, straightened his jacket from habit, and walked the length of the penthouse to the corridor outside Aria's bedroom, where Jordan stood at her post in the low light, spine straight, eyes forward. The posture of someone who had been performing professional distance for so long it had become a second skeleton. She turned when she heard him. He stopped 2 feet away and looked at her with the full weight of everything he now knew. You knew, Claire, he said. Not a question. Brigitte ran the tap when she made her calls. Old habit, drilled into her by people who understood that even expensive walls had thin places. The diagnosis is confirmed, she said quietly, her back against the cold bathroom tile. 18 months, probably less. He hasn't told the household. Only his doctor and the American know. The voice on the other end was unhurried. It always was. Lucien Marchand had built his entire reputation on the particular power of a man who was never in a rush because he had already decided how things would end. And the bodyguard? Secret Service, former. She was assigned to his wife before the marriage, knew Claire personally for years. He found out 2 days ago. He's asking Marcus to reopen the investigation into Claire's death. A pause that lasted exactly long enough to be deliberate. Good, Marchand said. That's everything I needed. Well done, Brigitte. The line went dead. Brigitte sat on the edge of the bathtub for a moment, staring at the burner phone, and tried not to think about what well done typically preceded. Lucien Marchand was 61 years old and had never once needed to raise his voice to end a career, a marriage, or a life. He had been positioned at the edge of Dominic Reeves's empire for the better part of a decade, patient as weather, waiting for the specific combination of vulnerability and leverage that would make absorption inevitable rather than violent. A terminal diagnosis, a reopened murder investigation, a man newly distracted by grief, and a woman he was beginning to trust. That was the combination. That was the moment. He placed the call to Dominic at 10 the following morning. "I have something you want," Marchand said, after the pleasantries neither of them meant. "Evidence of who ordered Claire's murder. Not suspicion, not inference. Physical evidence, documented, preserved, and currently sitting in a location only I control." Dominic said nothing. "In exchange," Marchand continued, "you'll step back from the Centerm operations, the Deltaport contracts, and the Richmond distribution network. You'll formalize a partnership agreement with my organization, and you'll marry Brigitte Laval, which will make the alliance a family matter, cleaner for everyone involved. And if I decline, then the evidence disappears, permanently. Claire's death stays accidental forever." A brief pause. "And I want to be honest with you, Dominic. Given your timeline, forever isn't even that long. It would be a shame to spend what remains of it watching everything you built come apart." The silence on Dominic's end stretched for 10 full seconds. "You have 48 hours, Dominic said quietly, to regret making that call." He hung up. That Jordan received her visitors at 7 that evening in the building's underground parking structure, the same level where she'd taken the bullet 6 months ago, which she suspected was not accidental. 2 men. She recognized the build and the stillness of Marchand's operators before they'd covered half the distance between them. Former military, both of them, competent enough to be worth respecting. The message was delivered without theater, which was the most frightening version of a threat. Leave Vancouver within 72 hours. No contact with the Reeves household after departure. If you're still in the city on Friday, the next attempt on the girl won't be stopped by a shoulder wound. They left. Jordan stood in the fluorescent quiet of the parking structure for a long moment, her hands completely still at her sides, her face doing nothing at all. Then she went back upstairs, checked the perimeter, reviewed the overnight footage schedule, and after Aria was asleep and the penthouse had gone quiet, she pulled her go-bag from the back of her closet and began, slowly and methodically, to pack it. She didn't tell Dominic. She had run the calculation too many times to pretend the answer was ambiguous. Her presence was the threat. Her absence was the solution. It was the same logic she'd applied to every protection assignment she'd ever worked. Remove the liability, secure the principal, except this time, the liability was her. And the principal was a 9-year-old girl who had already lost everyone she couldn't afford to lose. Jordan folded a shirt and placed it in the bag and told herself this was what protecting someone actually looked like. But she almost believed it. The light under Jordan's door was what woke her. Aria had learned, in the months since Jordan had become the fixed point of her nights, to read the penthouse by its lighting. Her father's office burning at midnight meant business she wasn't meant to know about. The kitchen's under-cabinet glow at 2 a.m. meant Mrs. Paulette, the overnight housekeeper, couldn't sleep again. But Jordan's room was always dark by 11. Always. Aria pushed the door open without knocking. Jordan was on the floor beside her bed, go-bag open, folding clothes with the focused economy of someone who had done this before and was trying not to think while they did it. She looked up when she heard the door. For a fraction of a second, the fastest fraction, the kind most adults would have missed, something moved across her face before the professional composure resettled. Aria stood in the doorway in her pajamas and said nothing for a long moment. Then, "You're leaving." Jordan set down what she was holding. "Go back to bed." "That's not an answer." "Aria, you're packing your bag at 3 in the morning and you won't look at me properly." The child's voice was steady in a way that was worse than crying. "That's leaving." Jordan exhaled slowly. "Sometimes protecting someone means not being near them. It's part of the job. It doesn't mean... My mom used to say that love means showing up." The sentence landed in the room like something physical. "She said it all the time," Aria continued. And her voice stayed level with the particular discipline of a child who had learned that falling apart didn't bring anyone back. She said the people who love you show up, even when it's hard, especially when it's hard. You showed up. You showed up in a parking garage and you got shot and you didn't even... She stopped, steadied. Why are you letting them make you stop? Jordan had held her composure in a parking garage with a bullet in her shoulder. She had held it at a graveside in November rain. She had held it for 14 months in this penthouse, in this family, in the daily discipline of being exactly what was needed and nothing more. She did not hold it now. I knew your mother. Aria went very still. Before Vancouver, before your father. I was her. It was my job to keep her safe for 2 years. And she was... Jordan stopped. Started again with the precision of someone choosing each word like a step on uncertain ground. She called me 3 days before she died. She said she was scared. She said something was wrong. I tried to get there. I was 12 hours too late. The silence was absolute. I came here because I couldn't... Jordan's voice fractured completely, for the first and only time. I couldn't keep her safe. The least I could do was keep you safe. That was the deal I made. That was the only thing that made any of it. So you came here because you loved my mom, Aria said quietly. And you stayed because you love me. Jordan couldn't speak. That's not a reason to leave, the child said. That's a reason to never go. She's right. Dominic's voice came from the doorway. He had been standing there long enough to have heard everything. And he looked like a man who had just watched several things he'd believed about the world rearrange themselves into a different and more accurate shape. He stepped into the room and looked at Jordan directly. I know about Marchand's threat. I know about Claire, and I know exactly what you were about to do. His voice carried the quiet finality of someone who had already made a decision that wasn't reversible. So let me be very clear. You are not leaving this family. I am going to deal with Marchand. But first I need to know everything Claire told you before she died. Every word, every detail. Because I think it's the key to everything. Jordan looked at him for a long moment. Then she nodded once. Aria crossed the room and took one of each of their hands, her small fingers wrapping around both without hesitation. And without ceremony, the uncomplicated certainty of a child who had decided something and saw no reason to negotiate it. Dominic looked down at her, then at Jordan. He raised his phone. Marcus, he said quietly, it's time. 72 hours. That was all it took for Dominic Reeves to dismantle 18 months of Lucien Marchand's careful positioning. Not because it was easy, it wasn't, but because Marchand had made the precise mistake that careful men occasionally make when they've been patient for too long. He had moved, and moving meant leaving evidence, and evidence, in Dominic's hands, was simply a different kind of weapon. Marchand's operation was neutralized by Thursday morning. The leverage he'd been holding, the physical evidence of who ordered Claire's murder, was in Dominic's possession by Thursday afternoon. He read it alone. Then he called Marcus. Then he sat in complete silence for 4 minutes, which was the longest 4 minutes anyone on his security team could remember. The truth, when it finally had a shape, was this. Claire's murder had not been ordered by a rival organization. It had been ordered by Marco Vasquez, Elena's brother, the federal witness currently cooperating with prosecutors in Edmonton, as a transaction, a favor to Marchand, exchanged for the promise of protection from the charges that were already building against him at the time. Elena had known, not before it happened. That distinction mattered, though not enough to save her, but after. She had known for 14 months, and she had come to this penthouse not merely to escape her own federal exposure, but to watch, and to monitor how close Dominic was getting to the thread that led back to her family, to manage the distance between his grief and the truth. She had sat at his dinner table. She had smiled at his daughter. The federal agents arrived at 9 Friday morning, 4 of them, coordinated through a contact at the U.S. Secret Service field office in Seattle. The one favor Jordan had been quietly holding for 14 months, preserved for the moment it would matter most. Elena was in the sitting room when they came through the door. She looked at Jordan once, across the length of the room, with an expression that contained something complicated. Not quite guilt, not quite surprise. Something more like the resignation of a person who had always known the accounting would eventually arrive. She didn't say anything, and there was nothing left worth saying. Brigitte was called into Dominic's office an hour later. He placed the burner phone, retrieved from behind her bathroom mirror by Marcus the previous morning, on the desk between them without comment. He gave her a choice: full cooperation, documented and legally binding, or consequences she was not equipped to navigate without the protection she had just permanently forfeited by betraying the man who might have provided it. She cooperated. Completely. It took most of the afternoon. The other 3 were handled with the clean efficiency of a man who had made his point and had no interest in extending the performance. Celeste, Margot, and Simone were each called into the office individually. Each found their specific secrets laid on the desk before them with the same quiet absence of drama. And each was given the same terms: leave Vancouver, do not return, consider the matter closed, and each accepted them with the particular speed of people who understood they were being offered a door when the alternative was no door at all. By evening, the penthouse was quiet in a way it hadn't been in a month. Dominic's legal team worked through the weekend. The guardianship documents were finalized by Sunday, formal, binding, comprehensive. Jordan as Aria's legal guardian in the event of Dominic's death. Every contingency addressed, every protection encoded. Jordan's hands shook when she signed them. She didn't apologize for it. The terrace faced west, and on Sunday evening the Vancouver skyline caught the last of the light and held it. Gold and amber burning across the water, the mountains behind the city going dark at their edges. Aria stood between them at the railing, her arms around both their waists in the uncomplicated way she had of staking claims without announcing them. "Does this mean you're staying forever?" she asked, looking up at Jordan. Jordan looked at Dominic. Something passed between them, unhurried, unperformed, the particular honesty of 2 people who had stopped pretending things weren't what they were. "Ask your dad," Jordan said. Dominic pulled Aria into his arms and held her the way he'd learned to hold her since the diagnosis, like someone who understood the precise weight of what he was carrying and intended to carry it for as long as he possibly could. "Yeah, kid," he said. "She's staying." There were still battles ahead. The diagnosis hadn't changed. Marchand's network, dismantled but not destroyed, that would eventually reconstitute around a new center of gravity. The legal proceedings surrounding Elena and her brother would take years. The world Dominic had built was not the kind that simply became safe because he wanted it to. But on the terrace, in the last of the Sunday light, none of that was the most important thing. The most important thing was a 9-year-old girl who had looked past wealth and credentials and performance and chosen the one person in the room who had already proven in a parking garage, in a hospital corridor, in a doorway at 3 in the morning, that showing up wasn't a strategy. It was simply what love did. If this story stayed with you, if Aria's choice, Jordan's sacrifice, or that terrace scene hit somewhere real, then you already know what to do. Subscribe, turn on notifications. And because the stories we tell next are built for people who understand that the most powerful thing in any room isn't money or status or leverage, it's the person who stays.